I hope you'll find today's topic useful. I'm going to show you what I think are the most useful Topaz apps, the AI apps. And if any of you have looked at the Topaz products lately, you know that they have a lot of them, and I often get emails and inquiries, what are the best ones to buy? And so that's what I'm going to do. For those of you that might be somewhat new to AI software, the AI, of course, stands for artificial intelligence. But what does that really mean? It works a little like our brains in that it takes into account the computer equivalent of experience, which is called machine learning. So the Topaz engineers feed the software thousands, or in some case, even millions of examples, and then it makes a judgment about your image based on that. And there are pros and cons to AI, but the upside is that I think it's an overall better experience in terms of saving time on the learning curve, and most importantly, better results than we could do previously. So before I launch into this, I want to remind everyone that I do have available numerous educational resources, many of which are free, videos, articles, and reviews, my newsletter, webinars, workshops, and so on. And the best way to take advantage of these is just to sign up for my email list. And let's see. So if you go to my website, on any of the pages on my website, on the left here, you'll see a place to sign up. All I need is your email address and a first name. I don't ever sell or share the information, so it is confidential. Just make sure down here that you choose one or both of these options, or you won't get anything. So just to start here, what I want to do is I created a couple slides here to hopefully delineate these things a little better and make it a little more understandable. And I also want to, so these are the three I'm going to try to squeeze in tonight with some real world examples. And I do want to mention Topaz allows you to try the full working versions of all of these for 30 days, so you can decide whether or not it makes sense to buy it. And I just looked this up. They also have a 30-day no questions asked refund policy. So really you have 60 days, which is pretty cool to give it a thorough workout and decide whether or not it's for you. If you do decide to buy anything, you can use my coupon code, which is JWolfson. It's on my website. I have a section called For Photographers, and if you look there, I've got archives of webinars, and I've also got a thing that has all the discount codes that I offer. So full disclosure, I'm an affiliate, so I do get compensated by Topaz with no extra cost to you. And in fact, if you use my code, you get a discount. So hopefully that works out for everybody. Topaz is constantly updating and improving their software, and it seems like every time I launch their applications, I get an update notice. In general, this is a good thing because it usually means some kind of improvement or a bug fix. And as I go along, I'll mention updates that I think are important or features, and I'll be showing you techniques and various tips and things that I've learned along the way. So this is kind of a workflow decision tree type thing. Don't worry about trying to memorize this. And if you do want a copy of these slides for reference later, if you sign up on my email list, you'll automatically get a response that has a link in it for this. If you're already on my email list, just fire me an email and say, Joel, I'm already on your list, please send the slides, and I will do so. So I'm not going to go through every step on here, but the important part really is at the top here, and that's what is your goal or purpose, and that will help you decide which of these applications to use. And then I'm going to be showing you what I think are the best ways to use them and where they really shine. These are fairly common uses up here, and most of us use some kind of raw processor like Lightroom on one, whatever it may be. And so these are kind of the steps, and I'll go through those. So I'll go back to Lightroom here. I'm going to work out of Lightroom tonight. I think that's probably still the most common raw processor that people are using. And I'm going to start with a simple image and a simple use of one of these applications, which is DeNoise. So here's a little girl with her bunny staring at a wedding setup. And I chose this because it's a good mix of subject matter and a good way to demonstrate kind of an everyday use of DeNoise AI. And I can also address the confusion that sometimes occurs with the overlapping functions among some of the Topaz software, especially between Sharpen AI and DeNoise AI. So whether you realize it or not, and a lot of you may already know this, every image requires capture sharpening. So when you capture an image on your digital camera, there is always a little bit lost in translation. If you have a DSLR, or most DSLRs have a low pass filter which purposely blurs the image, it harkens back to the day when the firmware wasn't quite as good and there were interference patterns. Some people call it a demosaicing filter. But whether you have one of these filters or not, you still need to do some capture sharpening. So if I enlarge this image, you can see it's reasonably sharp, but there is room for improvement, and that'll be a lot more obvious once I run some capture sharpening on this. In fact, I'm just gonna go back to my slides here because I do have one here. This one's on sharpening workflow. So those of you that are not familiar with this is a thing. There's a sharpening workflow, and for now you can ignore this top bar, but this is a traditional sharpening workflow. So you need capture sharpening on every image. Selective sharpening is just that. You sharpen certain areas to emphasize them. Some people call it creative sharpening. And then output sharpening is purely math, and that's based on two parameters: your input, which is whatever the resolution and size of your image, and what you're going out to, whether that's a low resolution image for Instagram or Facebook, or whether it's a giant enlargement or something in between. So in my opinion, Lightroom is still one of the best print engines and has one of the best algorithms for output sharpening. On ones is pretty good, but whatever you have, there's going to be some kind of output sharpening usually built into your processor. So let me just go back to this image. Now, to launch from Lightroom into one of these applications, you can either right click on the image. If you're on a Mac and you don't have a right click on your mouse, you can do an option click and then scroll down to edit in. You'll see these are all the applications that I have set up, and you can set these up in the preferences in Lightroom. If you're an on one, if you use it once, it'll then appear in the menu. You know, every program is a little bit different. So that's one way to get into it. The other is, if you're a menu person, you can go to photo, edit in, and you get essentially the same menu. Now you'll notice I use these a lot, so I have them at the top, and this is only, as far as I know, you can only do this in Lightroom. But you type in the name for it, I put a little tilde in front, so alphanumerically the computer thinks that's the first letter of the alphabet, or however you want to think of this, and it puts it up at the top. So that's just a handy little trick. And we're going to go into DeNoise AI here. You'll get this dialog that allows you to edit a copy, and normally that's exactly what you want to do, since you don't want to mess with your original image. And if it's a RAW, it allows you to convert it to TIFF. Now, I'll just mention something here. With Topaz software, it plays a lot nicer with TIFF. For some reason, well, actually I know the reason, but I won't go into it. The raw images, it kind of depends on the format. So my recommendation is any broad adjustments that you need to do on your image, do in your raw processor, especially things like boosting shadows several stops, bringing down highlights for more detail, that sort of thing. You probably want to do before you launch into any of these plugins or apps using your raw processing. So I'm just going to do a quick overview of the interface here, because pretty much all the Topaz apps are the same. So up on the top, we have things that have to do with viewing the image, the zoom magnification, how you view it. Right now, I'm in the side-by-side, which happens to be my favorite. On the right are all the controls for whatever package you're working on. On the bottom, on a lot of them, here, let me get rid of my dock there. You'll see the parameters that you've set. If you're doing batch processing, you will have several rows of these bars, one for each image, that you can scroll through and either make them all the same or set separate parameters. So all the ones I'm showing you tonight, it's pretty cool. They all have batch processing. So, and if you want to see how that works, I'll refer you to my previous webinars. I did one called Intelligent Workflow, and I show it in there as well as some of the others. I want to try to get through these others tonight. So now over on the right, we have 3 different modes, or 3 different models, if you want to call it that, for DeNoise AI. Right now, it's just on the general one. The DeNoise AI one has several settings you can use. AI Clear is kind of my go-to for capture sharpening. Now, some of you might be wondering, why is Joel using something called DeNoise for sharpening? And the reason is I find the AI Clear mode to be kind of my go-to for capture sharpening because it's fast, it's easy. Topaz could have put it in Sharpen AI as well because it's dual purpose. It does sharpening and it does get rid of noise. So it's kind of nice. If you have this particular image is not really noisy, but if you have one that's noisy, you can always sort of kill 2 birds with 1 stone and do your sharpening and your noise reduction. So since this is giving, I'm in sort of this before and after view here, you can see if you look on the left, take a look at these musicians, at the little girl with her bunny and her dress, and just look at the sharpness, you know, the hair, check out the musicians compared to the left side. You know, you can make out every little butterfly and all the lines on her dress, and you can make out the grass better. So even though the initial impression of this image is that it's sharp because it was properly focused and properly exposed and proper depth of field, that capture sharpening is really an important step, and I just find this the quickest way to do it. So these models, and I'll get into the low light one on the next image, you have a choice here. The AI Clear, like I say, I like that one for capture sharpening. That's not to say that I might not get an equivalent result using DeNoise AI, but I'll be playing around with the sliders more to do that. The AI Clear I like just because it's so simple, and this little auto button will give you suggested settings based on the image itself. So it's using the AI to help you determine that, and it's telling me here low and low. If I want to add a little more some sharpness, I can just click on the high. It may not be super obvious on your end. I can see that it's just a little bit better. And I will say the enhanced sharpness is a subtle setting, whereas this remove noise, it's not going to work real well probably on the high. You can see it's starting to mush detail because it can't really find noise, and it's probably interpreting other stuff as noise. So I could easily leave it on what DeNoise AI wanted to use. All I did was boost it to the high. So I'm going to hit apply. This particular one goes pretty fast. You can see up here, this is my progress bar. What you saw before was a preview, and the previews have gotten very accurate in the Topaz software. But what I'll do is I'll show you a before and after anyway. So it dropped me back in. This is my, let's see, it's my original one. There we go. Looking at a before and after, and let me make this a little bit larger. You know, again, take a look at the grass, the detail on her hair, on her dress, the musicians back here, the leaves in the trees, and you can see all this is much sharper just by doing a little capture sharpening. So that should be your starting point with every image. I think you got the idea of the before and after with the capture sharpening. So what I want to do now is do another image with DeNoise AI. This one is a little bit more of a challenge because there's a lot more noise in it. The color happens to be off because I shot this under tungsten light with auto white balance on a pretty old Canon DSLR. I shot this image at a winery in Tuscany, and this winery's been in the same family for about 600 years. I just kind of wanted to get the feel of the, you know, the timelessness or the age of this place. I ended up doing this, a black and white, but this is my starting image. And so in line with what I was saying before, I want to do, you know, any adjustments, big adjustments especially, before I launch into any of the Topaz applications. So all I really need to do here is my color balance obviously is way too yellow. Now I don't want to go completely neutral. I want a little bit of warmness here. But here's the challenge of this image. Let me enlarge it a little more. You can see it's quite noisy. So I shot it at an ISO of 6400, which if I did it on my Sony a7R III, it wouldn't be anywhere near this noisy, but this is on an old Canon DSLR, so I do have a lot of noise in this image. And it appears, you know, those of you from the film age, it's kind of like me, it's kind of like green. Now, before I go into DeNoise AI, you might say, well, Joel, you can do noise reduction in Lightroom, and this is true. And if we go down to, right here's the noise reduction down here on this panel. The color noise reduction in Lightroom is very good. If I go down to 0, you guys hopefully can see all these color artifacts, and Lightroom does a good job with that. Color, it's called chroma noise, chrominance noise, or color noise, whatever you want to call it. And I usually leave kind of a low default setting in Lightroom for this purpose. The problem comes in when we try to use Lightroom for the luminance noise, which is all this stuff that we see just kind of as grain. If I go here to the luminance slider and I start moving it over, I'll move the image down. If I keep going to the point where I'm getting rid of all the noise, you can see there's still quite a bit up in here in these areas that have an even tone. I'm going to be almost maxing this out. I'm up in the 90%. And you can see what happens is the detail in these bottles, actually the detail everywhere, the rope, you know, all of this, the grain in the wood, it all just goes to mush. Now, there is this detail slider to try to bring some of that back. And if I max it out, I start to bring some of that detail back. The problem is this is always a compromise with Lightroom. And you can see I've got artifacts in these smooth areas. It just looks kind of funky and weird on the wood here. So I'm gonna just bring those sliders back to 0. And I'm gonna launch into DeNoise again. And again, I'll do it on a copy of the image. So now in DeNoise, I'm going to be using a different model. You might guess that I'm going to use the low light. Now I could try AI Clear, but this AI Clear is really best for images that don't have a ton of noise, and you're kind of using it just to reduce a little noise and get some sharpening like we did on the other image. Again, I can, if I go to the high to remove noise here, I'm getting not as bad as Photoshop, as Lightroom, but it's mushing out the detail a little bit. So I'm going to go to the low light mode, and I can click on the auto and let it choose for me what I want it to do. And I'm just taking a look at it, and let me let it reload here, generate the preview. So take a look at this. This is pretty astonishing. We've gotten rid of all that noise on the bottles, on the wood case. Here, I'll move it over to the, so you can see this rope.
Wow.
And I get, yeah, it's pretty darn amazing, isn't it? And it's distinguishing dust and very slight texture on the bottle from noise itself. And if you look on the left in this wood, even just visually, it's difficult to tell noise from texture. But once it's gone, you can see the texture in the wood and all the details here. And I'm just using the auto setting here. I could play around with this, you know, I mean, I could probably bump up the sharpening a little, but I'm pretty satisfied with how it looks. If we go over here and you check out the, you know, the label on this embossed label here, wax or whatever it is, it's pretty cool. And if we look in the background here and you look at the smooth areas, you remember in Lightroom we were getting all kinds of artifacts. These lines are sharp, the background blur has no artifacts. It's just, I use this all the time and it never ceases to amaze me. So when you're done here, we're not going to do any masking in this one, but I'll show you masking in another one. Excuse me. I'll just hit apply. Now, rather than make you wait for this to process, because it might take a minute or so and we're short on time, I'm just going to cancel out of it because right before I came on, I did this one, and I'm going to just show you the before and after, which is going to look a lot like the preview, and that's sort of a testament to how accurate the previews are, and those have gotten better too in Topaz AI. So here's our before and after. This one's actually processed. I like to label in the name what I did. So I did denoise, low light, settings of 13 and 75. So that's 13 on the noise reduction, 75 on the sharpening. So I went up a little on the sharpening, but again, just like the preview, super clean on the smooth areas, unbelievable detail with no loss of detail and getting rid of all that noise. So voila, I mean, there you are. It's pretty darn impressive.
It is.
All right, so now I want to show you another one of the AI apps, and let me get out of this. I'll use this shot right here. So as you can see from the little information in the corner there, I shot this in Arches a couple of weeks ago, about 3 weeks ago, and I like this shot, and I used a new lens on it. And although I test every lens I buy, the problem with this one didn't show up on my initial tests, and I didn't notice it until I was editing my shoot. But basically, this lens is sharp in the center, but not anywhere else. I've since bought another sample of the lens, which is much better. But edges not being as sharp in the center is quite common. So even though this example might be more pronounced, it's something you could easily run into. And let me just show you. So if you look, the center of the image is nice and sharp. And I was shooting, this is a 9mm lens, so it's very wide, full frame equivalent of 13.5. I was shooting at f8, so this is not an issue of depth of field or focus or anything, because everything from a foot to infinity is sharp the way I have this set up. Obviously, there's no motion blur because I shot at a 2/50th of a second. Now it says f1.0 here. That's because this lens does not communicate with the camera, so no matter what aperture, it's going to say f1.0, just so you know, but I did shoot it at f8. So if I go to the edges, you can see it's kind of mushy and nondescript and basically just out of focus compared to the center that we just looked at. And again, if I go to the other side here, same thing. I was a little shocked that so much of it was soft. You know, it's not, like I say, it's not uncommon to have edges and corners a little bit soft on any given lens. And well, if I was putting this on social media, no problem if it's low resolution. But I often get clients that want very large prints, sometimes 6 or 8 feet. And with that kind of scrutiny, I couldn't do it with this one. A few years ago, I would have just written this one off because I couldn't fix it. But with Sharpen AI, I can. So you can see not very sharp right there at all, especially compared to the center. So let's launch into Sharpen AI. And again, I'm gonna do this as a copy. See, I can't remember if I did the menu way. I'll do it that way this time. So I can do edit in. I'm gonna go to Sharpen AI. I will, just so you know, I will also do one from Photoshop because I know a lot of people use that too. I obviously can't show every application, but you can launch these from On1 and Luminar and various, well, some things from Luminar. Anyway, you can launch it from a lot of different processors, even Photomechanic. So here's my image. Now this thing says, this is the same layout you saw in the other software. So we have viewing options on top. We have the controls on the side. We have this bar down here along with a mask button, which I'm going to show you on this one, how to do masking. So here are the 3 different modes. And one thing you'll notice on this one over on the right here is there are 2 auto buttons. So the first one helps you determine which mode to use. The second one tells you which setting to use for that mode. Now, here's the way I decide on how to use some of these. So Sharpen AI, as you know, I showed you DeNoise AI, how I use that one for capture sharpening and noise reduction. Excuse me, on this one, even though there's this sharpen model right here, which is sort of a general sharpening, you can use it for capture sharpening. With the masking, you can even use it for selective sharpening. That's up to you. But my reason for owning this software are these two, stabilize and focus. And that is because those are kind of the little miracle modes coming from the film age and early digital days when you couldn't do anything about out of focus pictures. I find this pretty amazing. So the stabilize is for motion, is for focus or sharpness issues due to motion, meaning your motion, the subject's motion, or both. The focus mode is when whatever subject you want to be sharp isn't, either because you or your camera or both missed on the focus. There could be other reasons for it, like this particular shot where the lens just isn't sharp on around the edges. In fact, around almost everything but the center. So because this has gotten a lot more accurate, I start with the auto. It's telling me stabilize. I'm not going to argue with that until I try it. I'm going to click on the auto here to give me my settings. So it's telling me for sharpness and noise, 35 on each. I don't know yet on the sharpness till I try it. I can say right now, just by looking at my image at this zoomed in view, there really isn't any noise in this image. I shot it in daylight, low ISO. So I'm going to turn down the noise suppression. Now I will tell you that I don't ever put these on 0 because I've found sometimes that it will occasionally affect the other slider. So if I want to reduce the noise suppression just to make sure I don't get any artifacts, I'll just bring it down to a very low number. So that's what I'm going to do here. And you notice the auto update preview is off. If you turn it on, every time you move around, it will regenerate the preview here. I'm going to do a side by side here so that we can look at that. And so now we got to watch it generate the preview. It usually starts out in the beginning a little bit slow, and this one takes just a hair longer than the DeNoise AI application. But so we're in the center right now, and although our center was sharp before, it did sharpen it more. It's using AI, but in my opinion, this is just slightly over sharpened. So when I go to sharpen this, I may back off on the center part. I'm moving it over to the corner here, and I'm going to let it update for you. I sort of have the middle of the edge all the way up to the corner. So once this generates the preview, I think you'll see a pretty dramatic difference. And I went from blurry rocks to sharp rocks. And if you've ever tried sharpening stuff that's just plain out of focus, you know that you get all kinds of artifacts and it just looks funky. To me, this looks very natural and very sharp. And again, this is one of those programs I just kind of shake my head and can't believe it every time I use it. It's really quite good and quite impressive. So I'm going to apply this. And before I do, first of all, I'm going to shut off my auto preview. And the reason I'm doing that is, as you saw, every time I move around on the image or change a parameter, it updates. And the smaller you go with the image, it has that much more to process. So if I go down to the zoom to fit here, in fact, actually what I'm gonna do is just go to the single view. If I had that update on, this would be taking a long time because it would essentially be processing the whole image for preview purposes. I already know what I want to do here, and that's I want to click on this mask and mask out the center from being sharpened. In fact, I'm not gonna mark it, I'm not gonna block it out totally. But what you're seeing now, well, you're seeing my little green cursor highlighter and you're seeing the brush, but you have all the brush controls down here now because I clicked on mask. So I can add or subtract. That's up to you. In this case, I'm going to subtract. In case those of you are not familiar with masking, black, this is a little thumbnail of it. Black conceals, white reveals. If it's in between some shade of gray, then it's going to partially show through the effect that you're doing. Edge aware, pretty self-explanatory, and it works well. I don't need that in this one, but if I wanted, it's sort of like the auto mask in Lightroom. If I wanted, to just do these rocks and not the sky. I could use the edge aware, but I'm just going to go with, actually here's the radius. I'm going to go with a large, quite a large soft brush. So that outer edge is the softness. That's the feather by other terminology. And the opacity, I am going to back it off to about 80% because I do still want a little sharpening on that center. And what I can, by doing that, I can again do double duty here and kind of do capture sharpening at the same time as fixing my focus or sharpness issues with this lens. So now you can see I have about the center third or so masked out, and the way you can tell it's masked out as opposed to masked in is down here with this little thumbnail, and you can see it's not quite black, it's a dark gray, which means I will get a little effect on it. So I'm going to go ahead, first I want to click on apply mask, and once I've done that, then I click on apply, which means I'm applying whatever parameters I put up here. And this one, it's doing a lot of calculation to make that image sharp again. So again, I did this one with the same parameters, and I'll show you that rather than make you stare at a status bar. By the way, that's one of the advantages of batch processing too. So if I wanted to do several images from this shoot, or any shoot for that matter, I can batch process. I can even batch process stuff that's totally different and apply different parameters to each. And then you can just, you know, go make a cup of coffee or something while it's doing all that calculation. So I'll cancel out of this, and I'll show you the, all right, this was our starting image, and over here, I'll try not to make it flip out like I did before. So looking at the edge of the image here, you can see, you know, let me make it bigger. So you can see on the left, we have that blurry softness from the bad sample lens I got. And do keep in mind that a lot of lenses are going to be soft on the edge, even normal to specification lenses. I'm very meticulous about testing, and I'm glad I did this one. So you can see that's nice and sharp. I'm going to move it to the center. And remember, I only did about 20% sharpening. I blocked at 80%. So it still looks nice and sharp, but not over sharp like it did on our preview. And I'm going to move to the right side here. And again, you can see just softness everywhere here from that, the softness in that lens. And here it looks sharp, but to me, totally natural. And again, pretty darn amazing. All right, so let's see. I am going to try to squeeze in one more application here, and that's Gigapixel. I get a lot of questions about Gigapixel AI. All right, I want to go to this image. Here, I'm going to go to 1:1 so you can see the actual image is pretty small. So there's nothing special about this shot, but I chose it for a couple of reasons. One, because I shot it many years ago on a very low resolution point and shoot, a 3-megapixel camera. And then this is a crop, so it's about, I calculated it was 1.8 megapixels, so under 2 megapixels. And I think it's a good way to demonstrate Gigapixel AI. Also, I happen to use this image for the same purpose in a webinar I did for Topaz on Gigapixel almost 2 years ago. So I was curious to see what kind of improvements had occurred. But I'll run through this so that you can see Gigapixel AI. And for those who don't know, Gigapixel AI, what it's known for best is taking very small, low resolution images and making them big and enlargeable. And it's another one that does a fairly impressive job most of the time. You can use it for different kinds of enlargement. So I not only use it for something like this, where I maybe have an old phone photo or an old low resolution photo for which I have no high resolution equivalent, and I'll use it for that. But the other way I'll use it is when I'm making really large prints, even if I'm shooting on say a 26 or 40 megapixel camera. If I'm going to do a really large print, you know, several feet, I still need to enlarge it a little bit before I print it.
Mhm.
And so I'll use Gigapixel AI. I might only be increasing it 50 or 100%, but it does such a nice job that I'll use it for that too. And also because it has batch processing, if you're doing 20 or 30 or 40 images that you're going to put on your Instagram account or on Facebook or on your website or whatever, it does a great job at reduction, and it does it really fast. So if you have a bunch of photos out of your Sony A7R Mark IV with that ridiculous 60 megapixel sensor, you can bring them all down to Instagram size. Anyway, this time I'm going to launch this into Photoshop. So just so those of you that are using Photoshop can see how I might use something out of Photoshop. So in Photoshop, for most of the Topaz plugins, you would go up to Filter, Topaz Labs, and you notice you don't see Gigapixel. Gigapixel was initially a standalone only application. They've since modified it so that it will work out of Photoshop, but what you have to do is go into the File menu and the Automate menu, and you'll see it in there. And I'll explain in a minute what's going to happen, but it'll launch me into Gigapixel just like you saw everything launching from Lightroom, and it's on the standard. So here again, we have the same kind of interface that you saw in all the other ones. However, since we're resizing, you have a resize mode, and you can do it by scale, which is 2 times, 4 times, etc., 6 times. You can pick your own magnification if you want. For this one, I'll stick with 4 times. And again, the auto update thing. But here are your models, and I find in this one, the little question mark thing, it explains about each one. What you can do is try them. So like you might think to use architectural on this. Now, if you look at the standard, it's okay, but I still have some noise, and to me the details look a little artifacty. I can tell you right now the architectural is not going to work well because it's made for stuff with fine detail. So it's a little better in some regards and a little worse in others. So compressed, if you look at their definition, for images that have a lot of noise and best for old photos, images downloaded from the internet, I wish they would remove that because a lot of that is copyrighted. And photos taken on old cameras, so you get the idea. I'm going to click on compressed, and you'll see when it generates the preview, not bad. So consider here, we're looking at the equivalent of something like an 800 times view because we're at 100%, but we're doing 4 times magnification. Remember, the 100% in Topaz is almost like 200% in Photoshop. So, and you combine those and you get quite a bit. I'm gonna move over a little bit to the trees here just so you can see, because this is one of the big differences I noticed with the new version is look how clean it makes that palm tree and all this detail in here. You can, if I move over to this mesquite or whatever this tree is, you can actually see all the branches on it. And this is going from a under 2 megapixel noisy, not very good quality image, and look at this at basically an 800% view. So when you bring it down to a normal sort of print size, it's going to be, you'll be able to print minimum 20 by 24, maybe even a 20 by 30 size print from this, what started out as a pretty low quality JPEG. So in this case, oh, I should mention on the interface, there's a couple other things here that we didn't see before. So I think this is similar to other ones you've seen. Remove blur is a sharpening, and it does just that. The suppress noise, it does just that. Because it looks good the way it is, I wouldn't mess with it from the auto here. And we already tried a few of these different ones. The art one, by the way, is for artwork, and I guess it also works well for typography, although I haven't tried it for that. But if you have, a cartoon or an illustration or a graphic or something like that, you can use this art setting for that. If you're doing people, it has a face refinement option. The reduced color bleed, I wouldn't use unless you have an awful lot of color bleed. Just sort of normal little bits of color fringing. You can try it on and off, see what you like. So and down here, this is just telling you if the color bleeds on or off, but you see the little smiley face and sad face. This is just to give feedback to Topaz, and I'm glad they put this in there. If you say you don't like the result, you can tell them why. There's a comment thing, but you can check the box. I'm sure that's what they're going to look at most often, but if you want to add additional comments, you can, and I think it's pretty cool that they put that in there. So just in case you were wondering what the smiley and neutral face is for, that's what it's for. All right, so normally I would hit apply to process this. This could take a while because I'm going from a 1 megapixel to a 30 megapixel image. So I'll cancel out of this and show you the result that I got in Photoshop, which is this one right here. So what happens, because Photoshop is a I'll go up to 100%. Because Photoshop is a pixel-based program, it's actually going to change your original file. So you have to be aware of that. Remember, we started with 1.8 megapixel, but now you can see it get to 6500 by 4500, which if you calculate it out is almost 30 megapixels. And,
that's amazing.
it is amazing. It's totally amazing. Now, so what happened is Photoshop also up-resed using its own algorithm, so this is a great way to compare. If I turn off this layer, look at what Photoshop did for its interpolation to bring it up 400%. A lot of noise, not a lot of clarity, and I'll click this back on and look at the comparison. And this is at 100%, so remember, if you made the way I view these, if I'm gonna make a very large print, and I want to simulate on the screen what it's going to look like when someone puts their nose right up to it on a big enlargement, I will knock it down to 50%. It's not perfect, but it gives you kind of an equivalent of what it would be. Okay, I know I went through this stuff kind of fast, but I would like to turn it over to questions if anybody has any questions about this. I think, Mark, you were probably monitoring some of these questions.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, everybody. And if you could just type your questions into the chat bar, then that would be the best way. I think we had one initial question earlier, Joel, and that was, do you use Lightroom's Sharpen tool? And if so, when?
You know, that is an excellent question. Sometimes, yes. Lightroom still uses sort of the old algorithms with the radius and whatnot. It's not, I don't know if they're using any AI with it. They do use deconvolution. So if you move the detail slider in Lightroom, let me go to Lightroom. This is just, I can show you my little trick for sharpening in Lightroom, but the short answer is no, I generally don't use it. I generally use AI Clear in DeNoise AI, sometimes DeNoise AI, and sometimes I'll use one of the sharpening tools in On1. But Lightroom, if I'm in a hurry to get some stuff out, especially if it's online, yes, then I'll use it. If I'm doing a big enlargement and I want to do critical focusing, no, then I'll probably use Topaz, sometimes On1, but usually Topaz. So I hope that helps. But as far as if I do want to use it in Lightroom, if you look at the sharpening, if you hold down the option key, you guys probably know this trick. At first, it converts it to black and white. This one, I think this is an already sharpened one, but you can move the sharpening slider to determine the radius. It looks kind of posterized, and I move this slider until I just start to see a change. And in this case, it's around 0.8 or 0.9 on the radius. The masking I hardly ever use because it's not very good masking, but if you want to use the masking, you can use the masking to just make sure it's sharpening the edges and not solid areas by using this. And the way you see all this is by holding down the option or I believe it's Alt key on PC to get the to see the masking. So if I'm using sharpening in Lightroom, that's how I do it. But like I say, my short answer is no, I generally don't use it.
Okay.
Other questions?
A couple other questions. How would DeNoise work on a star image?
Oh, good question. I don't know. I actually, at least recently, haven't done star images with it, but I would try it. I would try it because they have
Yeah.
so many different models and parameters, and I don't have a good example to show you, and I haven't tried it in a long, long time. Usually the camera is the bigger problem, and you want to often use multiple exposures and filter out the noise that way. But I would sure give it a try to see if you could do it in one step on one exposure from, with astrophotography.
Okay. We have another question, and that is that many people on YouTube state you can always over sharpen for prints. Do you agree with that idea?
They're kind of misunderstanding what output sharpening is.
Hmm.
So yes and no. I think you remember earlier I said it's pure math for output sharpening.
Mm-hmm.
So you can vary that somewhat. So like if you look at the output sharpening in Lightroom, which has an excellent print engine, I'm not a fan of a lot of things Adobe is doing now. So, but one of the things I still like about Lightroom is the print engine. The other thing I like is the database. Everything else, almost I tend to do in other programs. But so what happens is if you do proper output sharpening, especially for print, and especially say for dye sublimation, which would be like a metal print, or inkjet, and you look at it at 1:1, it will look over sharpened because it's compensating for what's going to happen when ink hits the paper or when you sublimate the dye for a metal print or something like that. So I think they're conveying it the wrong way, and what you ought to do is, if you don't have Lightroom for output sharpening, I don't know if you can, I think you can still get the Pixel Genius stuff for Photoshop. You want to be careful with that concept.
Right. Okay. Another question, is there a rule of thumb you would use for low light versus the denoise mode, or just try both and compare the results?
Yes, I would, if you have a very noisy image, I would use the low light mode. It doesn't necessarily have to be low light, but just noisy. So if it's high ISO or
Okay.
you really underexpose some shadows, yes, I would start with the low light. If you're not, and play with the controls too. If you're not liking what it's doing, you can try the denoise. But typically, if it's a very noisy image, then you do want to use the low light. Take a look at my intelligent workflow that I have on my website. If you go to my website for photographers and look under webinars, I think it's the most recent one, the one at the top. And I show an image in there, and this is a new phenomenon with software corrected lenses. So a lot of cameras now, a lot of manufacturers, Sony, Fuji, everybody does it pretty much. They'll, especially mirrorless, they'll try to correct for lens problems through software, firmware in the camera, basically. Sometimes it's translated to software in Lightroom or whatever, but what happens is you get uneven noise, because to compensate for vignetting, vignetting is a misnomer. It's really light fall off, but what a lot of people call vignetting. So light fall off on the edges, you'll find that the edges are a lot noisier than the center because of this software compensation. The low light mode in denoise does an excellent job of correcting that.
Okay.
Okay.
Just another question here. Do you set Lightroom sharpness to 0 before going into DeNoise AI?
Yes. Good question. Excellent question. Yes.
Okay. And someone else is asking what the lens was again that wasn't so sharp, and
Well, all right. First, let me preface by I have gotten bad samples of lenses from every manufacturer. So don't blame it necessarily on the manufacturer. I will say I get more from third-party vendors. This was Venus Optics. It was a Laowa 9mm. They're, I don't know what they call it, the compact dreamer or something like that. The best I've found are Sony, Fuji, and Zeiss. I've had the fewest problems, and I've rarely had to get a new sample. The third-party ones have been the most, and then Canon and Nikon are sort of in between. So I hope that helps. Yeah, don't necessarily blame it strictly on that particular manufacturer.
Another real quick one, and we're running out of time here, but I'm going to run a couple of quick ones by you and then we'll have to end. But
Sure.
to reduce noise more, do you take most of your photos exposed to the far right as you can go, of course, without blowing out the highlights? Is that still important, is kind of the question. Exposing to the
Yeah,
right.
that old exposed to the right. It's honestly individual to the camera how well that exposed to the right works, because they all handle histograms differently.
Okay.
Leica's the only one that actually uses raw data. Everybody else uses JPEG data. So it's not really, it may or may not be accurate. I noticed that the Fujis are pretty darn accurate for using JPEG. I haven't tested Canons in a long time, so they're all a little different. Generally, I expose for the highlights, if that makes sense. So it basically these days, if you have a modern camera, they are what are called ISO-less.
Yes.
And so essentially what that means is you're better off shooting at, if you need ISO 400, shooting at 100 and bumping up your exposure 4 stops in Lightroom or whatever you're using. And that way you'll maintain your highlight detail. You can bring shadows up pretty substantially. You cannot do anything about burned out highlights. Once they're burned out, there is no detail to bring back. So it's kind of like for anybody that used to shoot Kodachrome or Ectachrome or any kind of transparency film, you always exposed for the highlights. So if you think of it exposing for the highlights, that's probably the best way to say. So yeah, a lot of times I'm not. A lot of times you do not need HDR, and if you take my black and white workshop through Arizona highways this summer, you'll see just what a huge dynamic range your camera has if you haven't experienced it already. It's 90% of the time you do not need HDR to get a wide tonal range.
Okay.
And that's just a matter of accurate exposure.
Right. At the beginning, you mentioned something about TIFFs. Can you elaborate a little bit better? Is it better to, or a little bit more, I mean, is it better to then import an image as a TIFF versus a PSD file?
Yes. This is peculiar to Topaz.
Okay.
They use a certain raw library, and the net effect is that I have found with a lot of raw formats, it takes too much tinkering, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. Remember, if you ask 2 photographers, you get 3 opinions. But I think it takes too much tinkering to deal with the raw file. So I'll do any broad changes like what we just talked about, bringing up shadows 2, 3, 4 stops to get a high dynamic range photo, or just to maintain detail and shadows and highlights. I'll do those kinds of adjustments with the raw file in Lightroom on one, Luminar, whatever your favorite raw processor is. And then yes, I'll convert it to a TIFF, because it handles, all the Topaz software handles TIFFs beautifully, but it's a little hit or miss with the raw. So that's what I meant when I said that.
I see. Gotcha. And then last question, really quick. All 3 programs did sharpness and noise. Do you ever use more than one of these programs on one image?
Yes. An example would be, let's say I shoot wildlife. Okay, so I live in an area where I get elk and deer and all kinds of critters coming through. So I shoot an elk. It's a little out of focus. It's often very low light. So I'm either shooting, at dawn or dusk, and there's hardly any light. I might be cranking up the ISO, and so whatever the reason, it's noisy and it's blurry. I will usually run it through DeNoise first before I try to fix the focus, only because I found if there's a fair amount of noise, although you can reduce the noise in Sharpen AI, it isn't going to do as good a job as really tweaking it in DeNoise AI first, then open that image in Sharpen AI and fix the motion blur or focus blur, whatever the case may be.
Okay, great. Well, we are completely out of time, a little over actually, but we really, really appreciate this, Joel. This was super, super helpful and informative. So thank you very much for presenting tonight.
Oh, well, my pleasure. And thank you all for joining, and hoping you found it very useful.